We tend to think about invasive species as being associated with humans or human activity, but it turns out even 400 million years ago, long before humans were present, species invasions were a thing. So, what species were invading? Who were they invading? Where were they invading? And how can we even tell that there were species invasions in the rock record? Well, today I got to sit down with Dr. Alycia Stigall, an expert in invasive species in deep time, which I didn't even know was a field of study, but apparently it is. And she talked about all the cool things that we can learn about species invasions in our past, what they mean for our present and our future. And I'm not going to spoil anything, so let's just jump right into the conversation.
Hi, I'm Alycia Stigall. I'm a paleontologist here at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. So I'm in the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences, and I'm also the department head.
So as I mentioned to you, I am working with GSA this year to promote a lot of the work that's being presented, or that was presented at their annual meeting in September 2024, and that will be presented next year, as well as sectional meetings and their journals. And you had a presentation at their 2024 meeting titled Differentiating Between Ecological and Evolutionary Impacts of Species Invasions in Deep Time, comparing regional expressions of the late Ordovician Richmondian invasion. And we'll get into the meaning behind this title, but to me it sounds super interesting because we often hear about species invasions, and invasive species today as being associated with humans, but this is a species invasion that took place over 400 million years ago, long before humans were around to spread species. So can you explain how exactly do we define invasive species in the context of Earth's ancient history? And does it differ with our modern understanding of invasive species?
So that's actually the perfect place to start. So the first thing you want to do is think about kind of what is a modern invasive species. And so today we define these species as species that are evolved in one place, but then later get introduced into a new environment that they didn't evolve in concert with, that they don't have an ecological relationship with, and they become established and change that environment in a way that we as humans kind of perceive as problematic. And so that might have detrimental effects for economic reasons or cause extinctions or change the ecological parameters in other ways. But that's how we define it in the modern. Most invasions in the modern are due to humans, and that's not always because humans meant to move a species. Sometimes it's just an accident, but usually humans are the vector of that movement. If we go into the past before humans aren't going to be moving species, but there are still species that evolve. All species evolve in one place, but actually there are species that don't stay in that place. They move to a new place, to an environment they didn't evolve in concert with. They change the ecosystem in those places, and they might have detrimental impacts if you were a species that was there previously. So the way that can happen without human influence has to do with geological processes. So we might have an organism that's like a fossil brachipod. They live on the seafloor, but their larvae are up in the water column and can be dispersed by ocean currents. So they could land in a new place, live, thrive, and become invasive in that particular parameter. So we have the same thing. And actually, it's really especially interesting because if you look at the process of invasion, there's a particular way in which it happens in different stages that occur. The same stages happen regardless of what the transportation vector is, whether it's an ocean current or whether it's humans moving things. So once you get established, everything is really the same process. Now, in the modern, we can look at what happens over kind of years and decades, but then we run out of time. So the fossil record is really nice because it provides this complementary piece. We can't see what happened over a couple of years or decades, but we can see what happens over those 100 years, 1,000-year interval where things go afterwards. So we want to look at these things complementary. They're not the same parts of the process, but they tell us about different pieces.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting how, even just ocean currents and stuff can move, species to different places and cause these invasions. And we'll get more into other processes that cause these things later. But first, why should we care about ancient species invasions? Like, how is that relevant to us in the modern day?
Yeah, so one of the reasons we should really care is because We actually don't know the long-term impacts of modern invasive species. We know what can happen over years and decades because we can study that really well. But one of the things that we don't actually see much of in the modern is extinction, unless there's a predation impact in place. So if you've got ground nesting birds and there's a new snake, you can totally get extinction. But when we've got species that are like competing with each other, they change the ecosystem as far as like the dominance, but as far as will that lead to extinction? I don't know. Will it lead to speciation? We definitely can't see that in the modern. And so these are the types of long picture or big picture questions that the fossil record can help with. And so if we think about where modern biota is going in the next 100,000 years, having these longer time windows and thinking about what has happened in the past where we have a record can be really helpful.
Yeah, that is, I always harp on my channel about how important studying Earth's past is for understanding our present and especially for predicting our future. And so that's super cool. I didn't know that aspect of, I didn't even know that we could look in the rock record for past species invasion events, which actually brings me to my next question, which is how do we distinguish between native and invasive species in the rock record?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So really it goes back to our definition. So if we define a species that's native as something that evolved in that ecosystem, then if we have an evolutionary framework, we can say, okay, well, this is, species are like people. They've got a birth point, they've got a life, and they've got a death point. And that birth point is speciation, and it has to occur in a particular location. Just like you were born in a particular place at a particular time with a particular mom. Species have the same relationship. They have to have an ancestral population at a place at a time. So we can identify where that place was if we've got an evolutionary framework, but even if we're reading the rock record at face value, we can assume that maybe that's where that species formed. Then if it's got a record in one place for a while and then later jumps to somewhere that wasn't connected, like somewhere that was separated by some sort of a geologic barrier, maybe a mountain range, maybe it was land, a land barrier, and you're an ocean species, any of these sorts of things, then we can identify that, okay, it was previously here, now it is here. And so that introduction is going to be potentially invasive. Invasive normally means it's negative, but it's certainly an introduction. And then we can see what happens next.
Okay, and so we talked a little bit about, ocean currents being a possible mechanism for this, but what other than that can move or has moved or spread invasive species in Earth's past, if not humans? Can climate change cause it? Can plate tectonics?
Yeah, all of those things. So absolutely. So when we think about kind of invasive events or invasion events in the fossil record, I work on ocean animals. And so I like to think about things like ocean currents. But that's not the only kind of thing that's happened. And also when we think about the reason species aren't spreading is because there's some sort of barrier. And that barrier could be environmental. It could simply be that the ocean temperature is wrong here. There's some sort of maybe a river's coming out and it's bringing in fresh water. And so you can't cross that barrier. Or it could be that, there's a mountain range and you're a bird and you're not going to fly across that. Or it could be that you are a mammal and North America and South America are not yet connected. And so there are barriers in place. And when those barriers fall, organisms can disperse across them. And so when the Isthmus of Panama comes up, species from North America move south and species from South America move north. And we can have the Great American Biotic Interchange, which is an example of an invasion event. Things are completely different afterwards. We can have things in the ocean where maybe there was a land bridge or some sort of land, but when tectonics load, you've got mountains loading on the margin that pushes down your basin, that pops up an intercratonic arch. And if it unloads, then it goes the other way. And so now you can get ocean water crossing what is sometimes a barrier and sometimes not a barrier. So tectonics can be really important. And then all of those climatic processes. So if you change the climate, that might change where your ocean currents are going. That can change barriers. That can change processes on land. Is there a river or other type of barrier that is moved or changed? So all of those sorts of things that can reduce things that are barriers, that can allow dispersal and invasion across.
Wow, yeah, when you put it like that, it's like, oh yeah, must have happened just all the time in Earth's past. And that brings up another question. So you mentioned looking at invasive versus native species in the rock record, but is there something that you can find in the rock record that would indicate a large species invasion event versus normal spreading of species?
Actually, yeah, absolutely. So one of the papers I published a few years ago is really thinking about that question because it's really interesting, and we need a framework to think about it. So I developed a framework called the invasion hierarchy, which sort of looks at, okay, is this like a one-off invasion where the critters came in but just like dies and leaves like a couple fossils but isn't an impactor in the environment? And how do we, and then there's a level where they kind of show up for a whole level of the fossil record, but then they die. So again, it's a short-term impact, but a bigger impact. Then we get to spaces where there's multiple species from different groups coming in together, and that I call a coordinated invasion. And then we could go up to the next level, which is where you've got continents coming together, and you're really moving whole regions of faunas across. And then there's a kind of a global level. And so the impacts at each of those are going to be completely different. Not completely different. They'll add on each other, but they will be different. So a single couple organisms that drifted across an ocean current live for a few years and die. That's not the kind of impact that we see when we have, 60 different species coming in and completely changing the ecosystem. So it does scale very much. And that has to do with the types of barriers that are reduced and really what's going on from an Earth system process to determine how those biological processes play out.
Speaking of large invasions in Earth's past, your GSA presentation title mentions the Richmondian invasion. So when was this invasion and how do we know about it?
Yeah, so the Richmondian invasion happened in the late part of the Ordovician period. And this period is called, in North America, we call it the Cincinnatian period because the rocks around Cincinnati, Ohio are so well exposed and so fossiliferous. Within there, we see a big change. We see 60 different genera come in that don't have any ancestors in the basin for 5 million years before. So they haven't been here. They're not lurking here in the background. They're just completely new to this basin at this time in Earth history. So we've been seeing this actually, the Richmondian invasion was first identified by August Firsty in the early 1900s. And it occurs around Cincinnati. It also occurs around Nashville, Tennessee. And so we can see it in both of these places in rocks that are probably about the same time. But that probably is part of the science we're still trying to investigate. We're trying to learn more about, are they the same? What's the same? What's different between these two different areas?
So you said how many different genera?
About 60 have been recorded in Cincinnati.
That came into this basin that weren't there previously. What do we think caused that?
So it's really interesting because so the types of species that come in are kind of everything. So there are trilobites, there are bryozoans, there's a lot of swimming cephalopods, but things that are both swimmers and things like brachiopods that just sit on the seafloor and don't. So the mechanisms that had to bring these organisms in have to have something to do with ocean currents, because we have a lot of kind of larvae that don't themselves really have much moving ability. So clearly some currents have come in. But what's really happening is that there's tectonic rearrangement. So this is the time of the tectonic orogeny. So we're loading in an island arc on the east side of North America, and that is changing basin topography. We've also got some changes in the climate. It's getting a bit colder in the late Ordovician, and so that's probably changing a little bit of how ocean currents are flowing. But most of the organisms we're seeing that come in, a big group of them came from closer to the equator, so it's warmer species moving south, so that suggests some expansion in that direction. But others are coming from kind of the edges of the continent where the water is a little bit colder. So they probably showed up in at least 3 different pulses or groups of invasion. But overall, the sea level was pretty high. And so these different pulses of invasion happened from different directions, but within kind of about 1 million years of each other.
Yeah, and speaking of time of change, there was a mass extinction event at the end of the Ordovician period. So did this have any overlap? And if so, was there any like causal relationship there with the extinction event?
No. Actually, there is a little bit, but it's a stretch. So what is happening at this time is Earth is getting colder. So there are some ice sheets, but they're relatively small. When we get to the Hernantian at the end of the Ordovician, we suddenly get a big expansion of ice sheets. And that's related to the end Ordovician mass extinction. But what happens when you grow big ice sheets, right, is that sea level goes way down. And so most of the North American continent was drained of an ocean. So we don't have rocks related to the mass extinction event in these areas because there was an unconformity from the sea level drawdown.
Sad.
It is
sad. when we don't have rocks.
Are so great.
Yes. I know every time in Earth's history where we see that huge like regression and disappearance of shallow continental seas, it's, you know, you lose all this beautiful record, but it does cause mass extinctions, which are also fun and cool to look at when they're in Earth's past.
Right.
I did see on your website, I think you mentioned, I can't even remember what the title was or how it was related in the title, but you mentioned something about the Devonian extinction having an associated maybe species invasion. Can you explain that?
Yeah, love to. So once upon a time, I was a graduate student, and my dissertation was looking at how species invasions may or may not have impacted the late Devonian during the mass extinction interval. What is really interesting about the late Devonian, so when we talk about mass extinctions, we love to talk about the big five. And so there's the Ordovician, the Devonian, and Permian, Cretaceous, and Triassic. And it turns out that they're not all mass extinctions. So a mass extinction means that you should have statistically elevated extinction rates. That's not happening in the Devonian. At the late Devonian, you're losing biodiversity big time, but extinction rates are not really statistically elevated from background. What is happening, though, is in order to lose biodiversity, the other way you do it is by just having normal extinction happen and species no longer forming to replace them. So in the late Devonian, we have a huge decline in speciation, and we have globally distributed invasive species. So I was very interested in seeing, are these things related to each other? There are ways we might think they are. Ultimately, I'm going to tell you, yes, they're totally related. And here's why. So what happens is, if you think about what it takes to be a successful invasive species, you have to arrive somewhere, you have to persist in that place, you have to build a population, and all of those types of things you have to succeed at are facilitated by having a generalized ecology. If you can persist in more places under more environmental conditions, then you're more likely to succeed as an invasive species. So you end up with a bunch of species globally that actually have really broad environmental tolerances. Now, if we think about how that follows forward, is that if there's a bunch of species around you that are all generalists, it's very hard for new species to carve out a specialized niche and actually form a new species because everything is kind of already being managed. So that's the argumentation we put forward. We have lots of data behind it, but that's the argumentation we put forward about why speciation declines. So all of these generalist species that have invaded everywhere basically kind of limit or prohibit the ability for new species to form. And that, along with extinction rates, contributes to why we lose so much diversity at the end of the Devonian. And so that's the very top of my extinction hierarchy. That's level 5, global invasions.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting because I love talking about mass extinction events. And I didn't know that about the Devonian one, but now it makes sense because I've seen graphs where they show extinction rates, and that one doesn't have as big a peak as the other ones. It's kind of more of a shallow hump, but that makes so much sense that there was just less speciation, which is something that I wouldn't have even begun to know how to explain, but the invasions makes a lot of sense. So going back to your presentation at GSA, in your abstract, you mentioned that there were 2 contemporaneous late Ordovician species invasions in separate basins that had different impacts on the ecosystems that they invaded. Can you expand on the significance of these findings and what we can learn from this?
Yeah, so the Richmondian invasion occurs in Cincinnati area and the Nashville area. And we've known this for over 100 years. In the meantime, we have studied the Cincinnati area like crazy. We know a lot about the rocks around Cincinnati. We know a lot about how the invasion proceeded. Interestingly, we haven't been looking at Nashville. We don't know those rocks very well, and we don't really know what happened there. So I work at the University of Tennessee. We thought, well, I've spent 20 years studying Cincinnati. Maybe we should go look at Nashville. And so we started doing that about 2 years ago. So partly because we want to answer these questions. We know a lot about Cincinnati and the processes that have unfolded after the invaders showed up. We know that the community reorganized. We know that specialist species went extinct preferentially. We know that the species that persisted contracted their ecological niches in order to make space for more diversity on the seafloor and be able to maintain having enough food to drive their populations. We know that food webs became simpler. We know that species slightly shifted their morphology so that they were in less competition. We know a ton. about what happened in Cincinnati. And that's great because that's a wonderful long-term analog for the modern. But it's also a single case study. And anytime you have a single case study, you have to wonder, is that general or is that very idiosyncratic to that basin? So we went to Nashville and we said, what the heck is happening here? And of course, answering that question is going to take many years of research, but we have done some initial work. And so in the initial work, we're finding patterns that are actually not what we expected, where things are actually operating in a different way than what we see in Cincinnati. So in Cincinnati, we have some fossils. These are my favorite fossils. This is a species. I love this guy here. I'm going to make them big, probably out of focus, but they're great. This is a species called Platystrophia ponderosa or Vinlanderstrophy ponderosa. It's a big, beautiful brachypod, and it's been my favorite since I was a little girl and collected them in streams. In Cincinnati, they go extinct very shortly after the invasion. In Nashville, they never go extinct. They just keep going. The invaders come in and they're like, whatever. And they just keep being a dominant brachypod in the community. So we see some real differences. We also don't have as many trilobites. We don't have as many crinoids. So things are different in Nashville. And then we looked at those ecological niches and they're not contracting. Species are very stable. Both the invader taxa, the native taxa, they're basically like, and they just kind of keep doing the same thing. But there are also similarities. Diversity increases because you have the native taxa that persist, plus the invaders come in. So there are some things that are very similar, but there are some things that are a bit different. And we're probably too early in the research to know exactly what it means, but it does mean that there's variation. And variation is really interesting, and figuring out why that is. Nashville's closer to the open ocean. It has a somewhat different, very similar, but a little bit different environment. It's a different location, right? Even though they're close, they're not the same place. And so the pathways for invaders to get there would have been a little bit different. And so timing is probably a little bit different. So these are all questions and hypotheses that we're testing. We've got collaborators, particularly at the University of Cincinnati, who are working on, carbon isotope stratigraphy and other types of ways that can help us get at things like time. And so, which is very important to understanding these questions.
That's so interesting. And it makes sense, when we think about like, okay, well, if the same species invaded one place on Earth and a different place on Earth, the effects would probably be similar but slightly different in some way because they're two different places. So I'm curious, does this research, whether it be these specific findings or just our understanding of ancient invasions in general, has that led to a better understanding or better methods for mitigation of modern invasions?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's important, it is important. I think it really does help us get a better perspective when we think about modern invasions. It's also important to remember that the timelines we're talking about are different. So the timelines we're thinking about are kind of the long-term trajectory. So on a day-to-day, year-to-year management decision, we're not really directly gathering data that can help with that component. But when it comes to things like prioritizing elements. So we know that if you have a very narrowly adapted species, they're likely to go extinct. Whereas if you have a very generally adapted species, they're just going to persist. But the species in the middle that are somewhat specialized, but not too specialized, those are the ones that are likely to kind of be on the edge of whether they can or can't persist. So if you think about long-term resourcing, those are the species where you can really make the most impact as far as kind of investment of long-term strategies. So thinking about things from a long-term strategy perspective, that's a good way to kind of think about how this data interfaces with conservation strategies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And switching from kind of the negative side or connotation around species invasions, are there positive impacts that invasive species can have, whether it be today or in Earth's past?
So I think so. So some of the things that we see, first of all, is that invasions are part of nature. And so they don't have to be bad. We define them that way in kind of the way we talk about modern ones. They actually are only classified as invasive if they have a negative attribute to them. So if you think about it like kind of introductions a bit more broadly, yes, they can be really beneficial. Sometimes having new species come in, grasses expanding, open opportunities for other types of interactions, and can build some complex trophic networks. And we know that more complex food webs tend to be a little bit more stable. So there are some ways we could think about these things in the long term when we think about from an ecosystem perspective. So maybe not a single organism perspective or a single species perspective, but when you're taking an ecosystem perspective and thinking about things like ecosystem services, in that case, there are ways that certain species could be considered to be actually very helpful.
Do you know of any examples of us utilizing or kind of causing or spreading invasive species on purpose for positive effects or restoration purposes?
I know examples of when we thought we were doing that.
Yeah, that sounds more likely.
They usually go the wrong way. So, I mean, but if you think about it, in the history of conservation biology, absolutely. So doing things like introducing rabbits to Australia was intended to solve some problems. It actually caused much bigger problems in the long run, but biological controls, where certain species, or if you've got a particular species that has invaded, you might introduce the predator, the control species for that. And so there have been attempts to do this. This was more common kind of in the later part of the 20th century. It was perceived as kind of good practice at that time. And almost all of those examples went badly.
What a good lesson for us. Okay, so just a couple more questions just to round us off. So the first one, what questions remain unanswered about invasive species in ancient ecosystems? Kind of where is current research headed?
I think there's a lot. I will say that mostly what we know about, and this is a very interesting paradox. In the modern world, most of what we know about invasive species are land species because it's easy for humans to study land systems because we are land animals. It's much harder for us to study the marine. So we don't know very much about marine systems in the modern. In the fossil record, most of our really high quality record with dense data is marine. So most what we know about ancient invasions is actually from marine ecosystems. So there is an offset in this space. So learning more about ancient land invasions would be exciting. Learning more about modern ocean systems would be great too. So there's kind of an offset there. And then also some of these patterns that we're seeing, within the kind of invasion hierarchy levels, knowing more about how these operated other times in Earth history. The Richmondian invasion is our best known marine invasion in Earth history. It would be great to have more equally well-known ones so we can check those questions of like, how general is this, or is this very idiosyncratic, really, to build that general pattern to better understand things.
Yeah, I will say that was one of the things I noticed as I was going through your abstract. I was like, Ordovician, that was like before there was really before any land animals and before any, seed type plants on land. So it was before the land looked anything like it did today. Right. And normally we do have this association of invasive species with, land invasive species. Mm-hmm. We don't think about it so much in aquatic ecosystems. So that was something I found really interesting. I was like, oh yeah, I guess that could happen in the ocean. So finding more examples of that would be super interesting. And speaking of finding more examples of ancient invasive events, what are the biggest challenges in reconstructing ancient invasive events, and how might emerging technologies help overcome these?
It's a great question. So the biggest challenge is time. But that's great though, because on the emerging technologies front, we've got a lot of ways that the community overall is improving our understanding of geologic time. So we've got things like chemostratigraphy, we've always had biostratigraphy, but we're always improving it. And so all of these different techniques that we're having to better tell time in the fossil record, astrochronology, some really exciting stuff coming in about the Richmondian invasion potentially on that front. It's not published, but it's very exciting. And so there's a lot. So I think a lot of these ways of telling time is really helpful. Fossils, the more phylogenetic work we do, the better we understand the evolutionary history, and that can help fill in pieces too. So those kinds of things, I think, have a lot of potential for really helping us better understand the details as we move forward.
Both of those are really great points. I'm always looking at the geologic timescale, and I feel like every time I look at it, it's always getting updated, and that's a great point about the technology is getting better at that. I mean, we just keep making those more accurate, more precise, which is a great, move forward for anything with regards to paleo studies. But I also love your point about the fossils and finding more of them, taxonomically categorizing more of them. I think that's so important. So many students that I talk to are like, oh, paleontology is old, everything's already found, everything's already categorized. That's definitely not the case. And there's so much more still to understand about all of Earth's history. And there's 4.5 billion years of it to study. So it's such an amazing field, I think, that has a lot of implications for our present and future, as you talked about today. So thank you so much for coming on. Last thing I want to mention, I love the Ordovician poster behind you.
This is an artist rendition of the Cincinnati Ocean.
Oh, that's so cool.
So yeah, I love it too. It's my favorite thing.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And if you do have any last words about invasive species in deep time?
Not really. It's awesome. Keep looking for them.
Yes, keep looking for them. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.